have a very, long-standing experience in humanitarian operations. I'll go to Gary first, and then I'll ask you, Connor, to add your perspective on that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thanks.
Yes, very well.
Oh, good, because Caroline suggested I disappeared, and I haven't.
No, I didn't see you. Sorry.
I didn't see you. Sorry, I didn't hear.
Okay, well, I can see you too. So I just want to add a couple things to this wonderful conversation, this really extremely wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all of it, and I want to say, in particular, I'm really in agreement with Connor about the kind of the way that we've been thinking about these different issues being somewhat off, and the separation between thinking about violence in conflict zones versus urban violence as different is really fictitious, and I think a misdiagnosis of it. And we've seen this also. I mean, what is driving it, reason-wise, to the outside world might appear to be different, but to people who are involved in it, who are picking it up by seeing others doing it and by doing what their friends and the people in front of them, the little kids don't know the difference between war and just arguments. And so, I want to just continue with this aspect of this, which is its contagious nature, because we've seen civil war situations, we've seen civil wars end in Central America, and then the violence gets worse. It actually doubled post-Civil War in much of Central America. And the same thing was seen in South Africa post-Civil War, as it was. Violence actually got worse. And why is that? It's because the younger people had already incorporated violence, brain-wise, mentally, they're unconsciously copying the same things. And the social pressure to do it and the expectations of friends is the same thing. And this is also not only seen in the macro world, but also, the way brain science is showing this now. And, to Caroline's point, about this occurring within families, exposure to war, exposure to Israelis who are doing violence causes Palestinians to do more violence in their homes. Same thing the other way. Exposure of Israelis to violence by Palestinians causes Palestinians to do more violence in their homes. Why would that be? Since it makes no sense by any structural reason, poverty reason, or reason. It's just because the brain is picking up the expectation of doing it, the habits of doing it, the cortical processes of copying, the way mirror neurons work, and also because of trauma. And so this is really the stuff that needs to be interrupted. And so what is being done in a lot of different settings other than policing, such as what the mayors were doing in Colombia, either with structural changes or by shifting where men would be, or the things that are being done in Haiti with incentives. These are things about changing the framing, which helps change the norms. So the idea here is that these are really kind of somewhere between health-based and community-based solutions that have can be predictably expected to reduce violence. There's 3 or 4 or 5 sets of interventions. We've got 2 or 3 of them in a set of packages. Add the environmental stuff, add the incentives. The community is doing it themselves. It's completely parallel to or synergistic with or completely outside of whatever policing is done. I mean, policing can make things a lot worse. I'm actually not at all happy with the examples given in India. I'm not sure of them. The ability to completely destroy gangs and think that things got better, I just don't believe it. And it's not the experience in many other places that I'm aware of. In fact, It's quite the opposite. It's the appearance of it looking better for a short time, whereas it's actually learned that this is what can be done. So I just want to kind of end this part of it is that this violence, whether it's in war situations or in urban settings or in families, is stuff, and I really refer you to the Institute of Medicine paper on contagion of violence. The workshop proceedings can be picked up on our website at Cure Violence, and look at the methods as well. And there's a way out of this problem. There are ways out of this problem that all make sense, both scientifically and practically now, that give a lot of hope. They just need to be implemented, transferred, and implemented to scale. And it's largely simply about training of communities.
Let me go to
Thanks,
Connor.
guys. Let me go to
Can you
Connor.
mute yourself, please?
Can you mute
It's quite
yourself?
echoey. Thanks. Connor, Caroline has talked about some of the South-South approach, and I know that you worked a lot with community groups in Brazil. Can you tell us a bit more about it, and also from your experience as a humanitarian, how you see the humanitarian community working alongside municipal authorities, governments, the development community to respond to these pressures?
Yes, thank you. I think we have a festival of agreement here. I completely agree with what Gary just said, and also Caroline covered a lot of the points that I would have made. I completely endorse what she said. Interestingly, I was in Mozambique doing some work for you, Sarah, on the Mozambique government's response to some floods that they had a few years ago. And one of the things that they told me then was that they got a lot of their advice from study visits to Brazil, Honduras, and Cuba. And they said that they found that sort of south-south linkage far more useful and relevant to them, not only because climatically the situations in Latin America were more similar, but they also said because we're dealing with government, bureaucracy, corruption, lack of capacity. And the problem with a lot of the northern advice we get, the northern donors come along and say, we're from Sweden, this is how we do it here, and they simply think they can impose a model that would work in a northern global context, but simply doesn't work in southern context. So I think south-to-south linkages is definitely important and useful and growing. And it's interesting to see there's now more Brazilian diplomats in Africa than there are British diplomats. So the previous government of President Lula prioritized south-to-south linkages. And Caroline gave a very good example of Viva Rio working now in Haiti, and there's many other similar examples. I think humanitarians can make a contribution to work in violent areas of extreme urban violence, simply because we do have experience of working in conflict zones, and that counts for something. But as I said in my last remarks, I think we need to rethink quite fundamentally our attitudes, wherein use different analytical tools. I think Caroline spelled out a lot more the distinction between public and private violence, violence in gender, violence with families, and I think also to say that not thinking about violence as wars. I think that what is a war and what is not a war is less and less helpful as a distinction. Human rights law and the protections that human rights law provides apply in all circumstances. And I think that's something that we've got to get into our DNA. We need to unlearn some of the lessons that we took from the humanitarian community and think about things differently. To respond to the first question about things that have worked and things that haven't worked, as was said about India, we in Rio had a similar experience as the violence increased in the 90s. The governor awarded what was called a Wild West bonus, he called it an award for bravery, but it became known as a Wild West bonus, whereby the police got paid more by the number of criminals that they killed. I would say criminals. And that led to a huge increase in police killing. They were getting bonuses of 150% of their wages if they killed more people, and that was a disaster in terms of violence in Rio. More recently, we have something called the pacification process, where the police are going back into communities that they haven't been into for 20, 30 years. And they go back in force, they retake the community, but then they put new police units, which are supposed to be trained in human rights and community policing, and are supposed to be implementing anti-gang measures, working with targeting social improvements and economic improvements, and attempting to deal with the roots of criminality as well as the overt symptoms of it. To be honest, it's mixed. Violence has gone down dramatically in Rio, and it's gone down in Sao Paulo as well, so these are good things. Whether that's because of this pacification process, the jury's still out on. The violence has gone down in most of the cities in the south, and that's probably partly because of demographics. There's fewer teenage boys just as a proportion of the population as a whole. Also, the Brazilian economy's grown strongly up until quite recently, so there was a lot more work around, and the police have got better. Simply, they're better at using computers, they're better at using records. The justice system's improving a bit, so they're finding some ways of processing more trials. But I think our real experience is that it's got to be done systematically. And as I said, I was back in Mare yesterday, and the situation is very, very tense, and it's far more tense whenever the police arrive. I mean, people are much happier when the police aren't there. Police corruption is still a major problem, and there's been some high-profile killings and torturing of people. And I think the solution, and it's an obvious solution, is there's no silver bullet. And I think that's a problem we as humanitarians think, is we can make a difference through our individual efforts. But of course, you have to have systemic reform of the judicial system, of the police system, of the penal system. And that's an obvious lesson that we should know when we think about policing in our own societies. But I think it's something we forget when we think of, in humanitarian terms, it's the other, rather than seeing it as violence in urban areas as a continuum. And I think that's what we need to see it as. It's a continuum that you deal with systematically through processes of reform.
Great, thank you very much. Well, let me go to the audience. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please introduce yourself when you ask the question, and I'll ask the panelists. I'll direct the questions to the panelists, but I'll ask to be brief in their response to the questions, so potentially we can get in another round. Simone over there. And for the online audience, please do ask your questions through the live chat or through the Twitter feed. Thank you.
My name is Simone. I'm actually a former research fellow here at ODI, and I'm currently working on a narrative nonfiction book that deals with some issues of urban violence. My question is, Brazil is a highly unequal country. Many countries in Latin America are highly unequal. South Africa is highly unequal. Many of the most violent cities in India are highly unequal. And the idea that there's a relationship between inequality and violence is something that flows very easily off the tongue. Intuitively, it's very appealing. You see the consequences of structural violence, and those are incredibly brutal. But when you boil down the murder statistics in South Africa, most people are murdered in the proximity of an illegal drinking tavern after midnight by someone they know or after an argument with a stranger. And my question is really, what do we know about the causal relationship between inequality and violence?
Thanks. I'll say your hand over there.
Hi, Rachel Morn from Social Development Direct. I'm just interested in hearing a bit more of the panel's perspectives on the gender dimensions of violence, particularly in an urban context. So what's being done around gender-based violence, and also the role of women in conflict, peace building and security, because I don't think that's really been talked about that much yet. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. No, shall we start with these two then? Caroline, do you want to address the one on gender?
Yeah, but can I just say that I thought what was interesting that you didn't say that there's a correlation between violence and poverty. Because when I first started to work on violence in the World Bank, they all said, oh, it's poverty. And so the first thing we did do was there was some very robust work done by economists to show that it wasn't correlated. But that actually people who lived in very insecure circumstances, and there were a whole other set of factors, were often more likely to be exposed to violence. But that didn't mean there was a correlate. So there has been, and of course the main of the work was done by Fassbinder and people like that in Latin America, and there's been some very good econometric work. Whether there's been the same work on violence and inequality, I'm not sure. and I don't sort of work in that econometric world anymore. So, but I mean, I think it's equally important to do. So just to say that. On the issue of gender dimensions, well, there's a lot, the debate is out because actually what has been shown is that women in cities are actually, the levels of abuse and the levels of gender-based violence tend to be lower than in rural areas. And then you ask the reason why. Is it because they talk about it more? Is it because there's more support structures? Or is it that it's generally going down? So that there are lots of variations in interpretation about why this is going on. But there is a lot has been done, and I think activist groups, gender-based violence in urban areas is something that is very much on the agenda. And there are very interesting. If you look at the UN Habitat, they launched a sort of Women and Safe Cities program across Latin American cities. Now, what did it achieve? What are the impacts of it? We don't know, because of course the evidence base on UN programs is quite. But for me, what's interesting, I've sort of get quiet and didn't end my sentence. For me, what is very interesting is that it raised the issue, it raised the profile of the issue, and there are I can give you details later. There are some extraordinary networks that work on this very issue. And let's not forget, one of the first people who worked on this issue was actually Ken Livingstone in the GLC in London here in the 1980s. Tremendous local government work done in this city. Of course, Margaret Thatcher got rid of Ken Livingstone. She got rid of the GMC. And that was picked up and taken to Canada, and from Canada it went to India. So at that level of the sort of policy debate about the issue and the networks and all of that outreach, so you're talking about different levels of work. But I can share it with you. But I think that actually. Of course, it varies. I mean, we know that this recent brutal rape in India a couple of years ago, again, raised the issue onto the profile as an urban issue, and the whole relationship between violence and transport, again, is a very urban issue. So I think, again, I always try not to generalize globally because it's very important not to. So, of course, there are enormous variations, and I think the issues are probably, and those of you who work on African cities will know that the issues are very different there from, say, in Latin American cities. And the level of awareness and the level of ability to act on these issues, again, varies. So we need to be careful about generalizations, but I mean, it's come a long way in the last 20 years. I think we can say that. On conflict and gender, I'm going to leave that to one of these conflict people to tell us about. Like
Gary, I see you waving your hand. You want to come in on that? You have to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Gary, you have to unmute your mic. Oh, the problem is here. Sorry. Apparently the problem is at this end.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes. You can hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so to the point about inequality, it does correlate, although poverty doesn't. And so in a way, inequality and also corruption or trust in government, these are kind of like the dirty water of, as dirty water is to diarrheal disease, inequality and trust in government are to violence. At the same time, we're able to reduce diarrheal diseases like we're able to reduce violence by some fairly linear interventions when the other issues are slower. I would explain the difference between urban and rural violence against women rates as issues of norms. And when you get into urban areas, you're more exposed to a different a set of norms. And this brings up the what I think is an interesting and probably a realistic way of looking at violence is that violence is a behavior. I have to remember this. Of course, what I said, everyone would say, of course it's a behavior, but all I'm saying is that violent behavior is just a behavior. Just like eating behavior or exercise behavior or smoking behavior or sexual behavior, it's really violent behavior is formed largely through copying the behaviors of others around you. And the principal predictor of a violent event is a preceding violent event. And it's the same thing as for flu or for cholera or for other diarrheal diseases or for colds, the principal predictor of a preceding event is of a violent event is preceding violent event. And so this and then they pick up on each other, and then you have a norm. And this is why, you know, norms are changed largely by the people around you. And so as, you know, I would predict there's very little smoking in the room there. Whereas it was years ago, I mean, when I was in medical school, a third of us were smoking when we were watching angiograms of people who had heart attacks. And so these norms have changed. And so the police cannot police, you know, your sexual behavior or your eating behavior, or they're not what is really driving it. Our behavior is what you think your friends expect of you. So if someone in the room there is going to give someone a big giant social disapproval for smoking, or if someone's going to get social disapproval for doing violence against their wife or a woman friend, or doing violence in response to being insulted, then you have a shift in norms. And that's what some of these mayors worked on. That's what the Cure Violence interruption system works on. You know, that's what incentives work on. You know, you're all working together because there's a new expectation to not do it. And just the last thing is, you know, all this policing model of a way of reducing violence, it is another example of northern versus southern approach. It's a control approach, and it's got transferred. Whereas, you know, ordinarily, you know, our societies had ways of solving conflicts through various, you know, huddles or, you know, councils or whatever. And so they then would allow for a few things to be traded, and then, you know, that was the norm rather than a control norm.
Thanks, Gary.
Sure. Just to pick up on some of the points that Gary was saying. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think a lot of the answer to your question on inequality and violence, I think, lies in how we define inequality. We spent a lot of time about talking about how we define violence in this session. Not so much about how we define inequality. Of course, you know, what takes the news today is Piketty's view on inequity in terms of capital and capital markets and income inequality. But of course, as Caroline mentioned, there's gendered inequalities. There's, in terms of cities, you can speak of particular spatial inequalities, as Gary was mentioning, you know, where violence may or may not get very localized within particular neighborhoods. And at that level, at least the sort of ethnographic work that I've been involved in the past few years sort of is underscoring what others have mentioned in this, is that, you know, you can really break violence down into moments of experience. Whether you physically experience violence or not is as Gary mentioned, is an extremely good predictor of whether you will perpetrate crime or be involved in crime in the future. But also, it's not simply about the physical experience of violence. It's also about other forms of experiencing violence through, you know, mental torture, or even hearing about violence, hearing about how your mother or father was treated, particularly at the behest of the state, for example. If they've had a particularly violent interaction with the state, you know, it has a very serious and significant consequence. And in this, for example, we've been working with young offenders and reintegration programs in cities across India. It was sort of under the auspices of evaluating one of the largest sort of programs delivering recidivism-based interventions for young offenders in India. And you know, one of the main findings coming out of that is that it's not about delivering jobs to these young offenders. It's really and very critically about the continued counseling that they need years after being released from borstalls or the prisons that they're in, primarily because of this experiential sort of aspect of insecurity, experiential aspects of the violence that they've encountered. And one of the interesting mechanisms we found that's driving this is once young offenders have been through a program like this particular reintegration and vocational training program that we were evaluating, we found that if those aspects of counseling aren't dealt with, it actually gives rise to higher sentiments of entitlement, where youth are often predisposed almost. It's the sort of rough characterization of this is that their feelings of sort of taking what's not theirs are very worryingly sort of heightened after being through a program that's geared to reintegrating them into society. And so in that sense, if you look at inequality almost at an individual level, where you're not simply seeing it as an articulation of your income or even where you might live in a city, if you look at it in a slightly broader way, I think inequality can very significantly be, and it's not just correlated. There's some very interesting causal mechanisms going back and forth as well. I think the sort of obscurity of that inequality and violence link comes in when you look at inequality in the very big, broad sense of capital markets or income.
Thanks. Conor, I'll come back to you after another round of questions. I want to give an opportunity to more people to ask questions, and then we'll close with some final comments from each of the panelists. Anyone? Or maybe not. Maybe we can come to you then, because I don't see any questions. So do you want to add your comments on both the causal link between inequality and violence, as well as on the gender question, Conor?
Sure. I think I'll draw on my wife's experiences for this. My wife's a judge in Brazil, and she used to be what's called an itinerant judge. And these are judges that they go on buses or in the Amazon they go on boats to remote communities, favela communities often, which don't have official courtrooms. And her experience working as an itinerant judge convinced her to set up a program which became known as community justice, which started in her court, but is now a national program that the Brazilian government is implementing throughout the country. And what motivated her to set the program up was that she found that although she was, the fact that she was going into communities meant that justice was more accessible, it was still very traditional justice. She was, as the judge, going in and telling the community how their problems would be solved, making judicial rulings. And she realized that actually the community had the capacity to solve a lot more of the problems themselves. And so she set up this project, which basically they train community agents who are based in the community. They do community mediation, try to help people resolve problems one-to-one, but also they identify structural problems and then look at collective mediation and identifying collective solutions to their problems. And the classic example that's often given is that you have two neighbours have a fight. Well, they're two neighbours living together. The kids of one neighbour are out playing in the street. They kick a ball which breaks the glass of the window of another neighbour. The two neighbours then have a fight, and one hits the other one and ends up on an assault charge. So that's the classic. There's a knife fight outside a pub or whatever. But actually, you can try to resolve that problem, that level of violence, either judicially by sending one person to prison, or by trying to get them to resolve it just by mediation. But then if you look at what's the bigger problem is why are the kids playing football on the street? Because they don't have a playground. So if you look at the collective problem, the structural problem is that. Why do you have a fight between neighbours? Because there's not sufficient space, or because the state isn't providing sufficient social services. Brazil was urbanized. It was one of the fastest urbanizations that had taken place in human history. More recently, China's doing the same thing. But the urbanization of Brazil went from being predominantly a rural society to predominantly urban society in about 20 years. And that laid the basis for suddenly you had large numbers of people living in greater proximity to each other without sufficient social services, without green spaces, living in very densely populated areas. And that was part of the basis for why violence, not necessarily physical violence, but social interaction became extremely problematic. You add into that the economic crisis that followed the fall of the dictatorship. That was what led to the basis of this massive social explosion of violence. It's true that a lot of that violence might be between neighbours, but why does that happen? It happens because the state is entirely absent in terms of its duties. There's very little social mores about how people live together, and there's very few avenues and mechanisms to help people resolve their conflicts. If you go back to what happened in Britain during industrialisation, it's no coincidence. Look at the parks like Hackney Park in East London, Victoria Park in East London, which was open because of the problems of massive disease and massive urban squalor. The phrase Victorian values was an attempt to inculcate into people learned behaviours, social mores, how people should interact with each other. These things are all happening now in developing countries throughout the world, developing and middle-income countries. It's not coincidence that now in Brazil, violence in the southern cities, São Paulo, Rio, Porto Alegre, is beginning to diminish, but that's been more than matched by an explosion of violence in the northeast, where the cities are still in formation, where people are still going in large numbers into the cities. Because the state isn't creating sufficient mechanisms to help people and to empower people. And if you look at state policy, the criminalisation of drugs, who does that affect? Mainly it affects young, black, urban males. They end up in prison, they get brutalised in prison, they then come out of prison, there's no jobs for them to go to, they go to pubs, or they go to bars, they get drunk, they get into fights, and so you have that knife fight. So I agree, it's not just, the relationship between inequality and violence is not quite so clear, but it's an underlying problem, and also it's poverty, and poverty is not just about lack of income, poverty is also about lack of rights, lack of social power, lack of social cohesion. So I'd say those, if you put all of those things together, you do clearly get a link between violence and inequality, defined in that sense. On gender, I'd agree with what Caroline said. I think women's situation tends to improve in urban areas compared to rural areas. Obviously, in some cases, reporting goes up, but I think women get opportunities to work outside the home, women get opportunities to more visibility and to claim their rights. So I think urbanisation is generally a good thing in terms of women's rights. On gender and peacekeeping, I'm going to have to pass. I helped the Department of Peacekeeping Operations devise some of their training.
We have no time.
On protection.
You know too much on that subject. So. Thanks. We did start late, but I am told that we have to finish on time because of the availability of one of the speakers for the next session. So I'm sorry I have to cut this, short. But I mean, Caroline and Jadip will be here for the rest of the afternoon, so you can continue to interact and ask questions. But let me thank in particular Connor and Gary that have been with us from the other side of the globe, and all the panelists. Please join me in thanking them for what has been a really interesting, stimulating discussion. Thank you. Thank you. There is a short coffee break, but the next session does need to start at 3 o'clock. So you're welcome to grab a coffee really quickly next door, but then the next session will have to start on time at 3. Thank you. Thank you.